PSR, because obviously Villa are feeling it more now because they've spent a little bit of money trying to get to where they are. They're in the Champions League, so they
Mm.
won't see that windfall for a season or so. But they are still trying to balance the books. Players coming the other way as part of this deal for Douglas Luiz. So many clubs are copying that model now, aren't they? Where they're kind of exchanging players and talking about inflating fees to kind of make it seem like it's more pure profit for homegrown players. We won't accuse any clubs, but the system is kind of making clubs become more inventive, isn't it? And obviously Aston Villa had to be very inventive really about who's coming in and who's going. So talk us through the comings and goings apart from Luiz that we've seen so far.
I think before we get to that, it's important to address what the situation is and why Villa are being like that, though, as well. Because I feel like there is a real critical eye on Aston Villa, particularly, and Everton and Chelsea at the moment for doing this. But I think it's worth pointing out that these rules that are in place are massively set up to favour the hierarchy. And when you've got a team like Newcastle last year and Villa this year that push hard to compete at the top end, it's always going to take financial backing to do that. They've done that successfully without being ridiculous, if we're honest. It doesn't look like Aston Villa spent ludicrous amounts of money on the players they brought in last summer, for example. Then you are obviously going to need to put more money in to stabilise that and keep yourselves competitive. Otherwise, you just fall back off and let the top four back in. So our owners went to the Premier League, pitched a new idea for what they think PSR should look like to make it competitive and at least bring those teams back into contention. And they were laughed off, basically. So now this is what it takes. And it is a bit more creative. And I think so be it. It's a shame, to be honest, because we've got a really good academy and we've done well to build that up over the last couple of years. And we've brought in a lot of young talent from elsewhere and kind of harnessed them as our own. And now we're kind of being forced to sell them. But all the complaints aimed at Villa for kind of rigging the system, you're kind of picking on the little guy there who's done it this window because their hands forced. Let's not forget, like, Man City have made 65 million euros in the last 2 seasons alone of selling under 21 players just to Southampton. Not even generally, just to one club, 65 million euros for players that have never played for them in the Premier League. So this isn't a new thing. It's just that right now there are more and more clubs being forced to think like it because PSR seems so tight on everyone right now, doesn't it?
I totally understand and empathise with clubs that are trying to better themselves having to do this because it will create more of a division. And I know the idea of PSR is to stop that division happening and to keep reining in spending from clubs that have got the resources to go mental if they wanted to. But it does mean that any club that doesn't have a massive amount of revenue coming in, like Luton, for example, how are they ever going to be able to spend the money they needed to? It's just not going to happen. And we're finding even a Champions League qualifier like Aston Villa are still at the moment, because of the last 3 years of spending, probably on players like Coutinho and his wages. I think me and Dave mentioned it before we recorded. You're still kind of paying the price for that kind of legacy, really, aren't you? That, I guess, unfair in some ways, but can you also see why that might be sensible thought taking over again in some ways as well?
To a degree, but I think when you know the kind of backing that the owner can put into the club, like his net worth's about 9 billion US dollars, which is a crazy amount of money. So it's not like the future of the club is at risk there, and the stability is definitely there. You can see it's a long-term project. And all right, we probably overspent on Coutinho, but we made 100 million off Jack Grealish within this window as well. We need to remember. And actually last season, think about what Villa spent. They brought in Pau Torres, Moussa Diaby, and then Tielemans was a free. So we're not spending ridiculous amounts of money. It's not the kind of Man City, Chelsea moves we saw when they first got big money. Instead, it's just kind of par for the course. It doesn't really feel like Villa are spending much more than anyone else, really. If Wolves can afford to bring in Mateus Cunha for nearly 45 million, for example, then realistically, we're not playing on an uneven field by doing that. What makes it more difficult is then stripping it back and saying, okay, you've got to the Champions League. Your Champions League revenue isn't going to contribute towards your totals for another year, but you've got to compete in the Champions League without spending any money and selling your best players. So it feels like if we this summer gone out and sold Ollie Watkins for 85 million, or Martinez for 50 million, then no one would be moaning about how Villa were making their money. But because they've done it methodically and sold academy players, then it's like, well, that's not what we wanted from Villa right now. So now I have to pick holes in it. And that, I don't know, I find that ludicrous, to be honest.
I think the optics of signing young players or training up young players and then not even seeing the first team, Dave, and going out for much bigger fees is a model that Chelsea have been doing for a decade almost, isn't it, really? without actually needing to balance the books as much as they are now. So this isn't a new phenomenon.